Morning everyone. So I'm going to talk to you today and give you a flavour of the book chapter that I've done for the edited collection. I will focus on my research that used email interviewing as a way of generating data with my participants in my PhD research. So as an overview, a summary really, email interviewing offers a really inexpensive and convenient method of generating what I would consider in-depth qualitative data. So I'll show you some data later and you'll get a sense of the richness that you can get from using emails to interview people. I am drawing on my own research, as I said, so I used email interviews in a qualitative mixed method study of what I say are older music fans, because they're only 30 and above, and now I'm 30 and above, I'll put it that way. I do older in inverted commas, because obviously I'm not old. They range, the participants, from 30 to in their 60s, so they weren't the elderly, but sort of middle-aged music fans. I'm going to focus very much on how the method works in practice. So this is a bit of a how-to guide, really, hopefully accessible. And I will reflect later on some of the differences between the written and the spoken in terms of data collection, because I thought that was quite an interesting aspect of email interviewing. I'll also think about the advantages, the disadvantages, some of the pitfalls that we can experience if we use email to collect data. Okay, so my research. My PhD was about popular music and the life course, so it looked at how ageing impacts on people's involvement in music scenes. I explored the significance, the importance of music, the meaning of it, how people socially use music and fandom long term as they grow older, as their life develops. As I said, it's mixed methods, so I don't think I'd have got the funding I got back in 2005, not in Tory Britain. I think I was really lucky. I went to gigs and did participant observation. I went to festivals, soul weekenders. Yeah, I don't think this would get funding now. It was a lot of hard work, that PhD. Face-to-face and email interviews were conducted alongside the observation that I conducted. So I decided to do 3 case studies for the research. 3 distinct music scenes were chosen. So I looked at Northern Soul. The image there represents Northern Soul, quite a classic image. If you're not familiar with Northern Soul, do Google it. It's quite a fascinating scene that began in the 1960s, still going today. People think of it as quite a historic scene, but it does still go on today. Rock music, obviously a broad category, so I looked at older rockers, ageing rockers. And then electronic dance music, which is quite an academic term for clubbing, people that go clubbing, raving, in their middle age. So you might think about, the old guy with his top off on the dance floor, giving it some, or at a festival. They're the kind of people that I interviewed and spoke with for the research. So I did use the internet in 2 ways for the research. One was to recruit participants. So I used message boards that we've already discussed a little bit this morning, online forums, and I also used it to collect data. So I had 2 types of data generated via the internet. One was email interviews, the focus of today, and the other was online discussion forums, message boards, that I think David is going to talk about later, and Brendan has touched upon a little bit already this morning. Now, I decided to include email interviews because people were turning me down for face-to-face interviews. I decided I would offer, when I did a bit of a pilot study, people didn't want to meet me. I didn't do interviews inside the music space, by the way. I would speak to people at gigs during participant observation, at clubs, and say, will you meet me? And have an interview, and some of them were just saying, like, well, here's my number, oh, I've not got a time to meet you. So I ended up coming up with the idea of doing email interviews. Now, email was favoured by the vast majority of respondents, so 55 out of 70 interviews that took place were done over email. Then that was because participants liked the fact that it was unobtrusive, it was flexible, it was convenient. for the participant to conduct the interview in their own time. It also was good for the researcher because I could overcome any limitations in terms of time and financial resources as well, having the money to go and meet people and the time, like the temporal distance as well. Okay. So I won't dwell on this because it's all fairly common sense now. We've had a huge growth in ICT, haven't we, in internet technologies in recent years. As Brendan mentioned, we very much live in a digital society. There's been a significant increase in the use of email, so professionally and personally. We can't really get away now without using email in our everyday lives in terms of particularly in professional arenas. And what we need to think about is the opportunities that this gives us to rework traditional research methods within online environments. So how can we gain new understandings of experiences that people go through better using the internet and World Wide Web? There's a quote there from Hein. There's a virtual laboratory. Data can be collected 24 hours a day across the globe. The internet fundamentally changes the ways in which we can observe, measure and report on the human condition and societal structures. So, I'll get down to sort of the nitty-gritty of email interviewing. Now, it's called various things within academic literature on the subject. So I call it email interviewing in the writing that I've done, in my research. It's also known as online interviewing, electronic interviewing, and then the very academic term asynchronous computer-mediated communication, or CMC for short. There are two main styles that you can use in email interviewing. The first one is asynchronous. And that's what I used. So it wasn't in real time. I would send the respondent questions or a question, and then they would respond at their own time, in their own convenience, at their own pace. Synchronous is a bit more like doing a Skype interview or using a messenger tool. So that's in real time. You log on at a mutually convenient time and email each other that way. So with asynchronous interviews, the time frame is stretched out. As a researcher, you might be, or would be likely, that you're having multiple interviews running simultaneously. So you might want to think about sort of the practicalities of that. You also need to think about the time in terms of it's quite a lot of investment on behalf of the researcher, reading responses, thinking about the next questions you want to send. The fact that you might want to pose further questions, and it might involve more than just a typical 1.5 hour face-to-face interview in terms of the time that you're investing. So the advantages, very much from a researcher perspective, the convenience. So they were efficient, they were cost-effective and very convenient in terms of generating rich, detailed data. They were very flexible. They might be more willing for people to be interviewed because they don't have to attend physically a face-to-face interview. You've got a reduced impact of time, space, travel, and you've also got time to reflect in terms of the data gathering process. Now, for participants, there was the convenience, the flexibility, but there's also a sense of anonymity that I'll go on to in a little bit more depth in a moment. So a bit like with the online discussion support forums we heard about, the participant can have some control over telling their own story. So they get to think about, carefully consider what they're writing. They have a potential to edit and revise and really carefully think about the story that they're telling. They can really reflect in terms of sending a response. Obviously that has a lot of implications for the kind of data that's generated, and that's one of the things about the differences in the oral and the written in terms of the data that you get. What's also been touched upon is this idea that you don't have to transcribe when you do email interviews. Now, if you are conducting a lot of face-to-face interviews and you don't have the funds to pay someone to transcribe, transcribing is a real investment from you in terms of the research process. You just print off the emailed responses. So again, it's convenient, which is a great thing, obviously, as a researcher. It also gives you more time to actually do your data collection and analyse it, because you're not having to worry about the time invested in transcription. You can avoid some of the disadvantages or pitfalls, if you like, in transcription. So not hearing the audio recording correctly, some of the ambiguity you can get with that. And also, the data that's produced is exactly that's produced in the interview process. So there's an argument that email transcripts can be more accurate because it's not your interpretation of what you can hear on a recording. Now, one of the really interesting things, I think, with email interviewing is this idea of someone being behind the computer screen and not actually seeing you face to face, and what that means in terms of the participants' feelings and emotions and what they tell you, so the kind of data that you get. Now, if you think about face-to-face interviewing, it's quite a demanding skill, isn't it, on behalf of the researcher. It's especially challenging if you're an inexperienced researcher or you're nervous, and especially around sensitive topics as well. So you get away a bit from that with email interviews, because you're sending some questions and you've not got the nerves that you might feel in a face-to-face setting. They are good, I'll go on to that a little bit more later, for sensitive topics because of that degree of anonymity that you get. It also reduces the sense of pressure felt by researchers and possibly participants. In terms of literature, there are different opinions on what that means for openness and anonymity. Some argue that there's an over-disclosure because people consider the responses, which you can see on that last point there. So in my research, people discussed recreational drug use, which is a thing within music scenes, and intoxication. They discussed that a lot in the email interviews. If they did bring it up face-to-face, it was once I'd switched the audio recording equipment off. So once I'd pressed stop on the recording, they'd often talk about drug use. In the email interviews, they were very frank, open, honest about the drugs they'd taken through their history of being involved in a music scene. So there's an issue there ethically, isn't there, in terms of protecting the participants. And there's a reference there in terms of looking at ethical issues. Because it's a fairly new area, there is a lot always coming out in terms of ethics of internet research that you need to be aware of. So socially undesirable behaviour, if you like, might be more admitted in an email sense. So within the asynchronous email interviews, the participants could choose to devote the time they wanted to the research, to responding to the questions that I sent. So some would spend a few days sending responses back. Others would take a few weeks up to a month to write detailed responses. One chap that stands out would Friday and Saturday night, whilst he was drinking his red wine, respond via email, which obviously another ethical issue there. One of the reasons I didn't do interviews within the club space or the gig space was to try and get away from the fact that people are intoxicated, but often they were intoxicated even though they were sat at the computer emailing, so it didn't negate that anyway. What you get is very much contemplation on the part of the participant. They need to invest time and effort and a commitment, really. So you need to think about that if you do consider using email interviews, who it suits, which I'll go on to in a moment. But a key thing here is there's an ability to review and revise responses. They can delete, they can edit, which makes the data collection, the process, quite different to what's produced, particularly in face-to-face settings. It's really important to think about that significance of the written and the fact you've got this ability to scroll through, to change what you're saying and have a polished account at the end of it. Obviously, it's less spontaneous, so if you're speaking to someone face-to-face and recording that, you get a very spontaneous dialogue, don't you, with that person. Because there's not the spontaneity, and because my research was looking at someone's sort of musical history and their identity around that, it was good, it was an advantage that it was less spontaneous because they could carefully consider and reflect and think about their past experiences. But you do get polished accounts, written in their own words, authoring their own experiences. So I've got an example of a fairly polished account that I won't read out, I'll let you read and take a moment. So this is a Northern Soul fan, 59 at the time. I hope everyone can see it, some people are moving like that. I usually wait for the laugh to know that people are getting a little bit near the end. So that is a male 59-year-old Northern Soul fan. And what I hope you get a sense of there is that the richness and the polished nature of that data that is different in terms of that is very much a written account rather than what someone would say. There aren't obviously the breaks, the pauses that you'd get face to face. It does have a conversational tone, there are some slang words in there, but it is carefully structured. You can tell it's been considered and it's been revised and read through perhaps a couple of times before it's been sent back. And this was the participant that took up to a month to send back responses, and I got some really detailed data from him. So he's really thoughtfully reflecting there on the part that music's played in his life. You also get a sense of the articulate nature as well of emailed data. It's obviously driven by the participant's agenda. There's no interruptions from the researcher that you get in face-to-face interviewing. Obviously, good face-to-face interviewing, you want minimal interruption. But the first face-to-face interview I ever did, which was when I was doing my masters, I realised I could hear me mm-ing more than the actual participant saying, and I realised that then I had to revise my own techniques in terms of face-to-face interviewing. You've got the presence of the researcher there in a sense because you're asking questions, but it's very much driven by the participant themselves. So, I've spoken about my research. Obviously, email interviews have been used in other areas. So, I'll think a little bit about what research questions email interviews might suit. They are suited to certain topics more than others. I would argue that they lend themselves well to generating written accounts of people's experiences, their memories, their recollections. They were very well suited to my research because I was asking people to recollect long-term involvement in a particular scene. So some people have got like 30-year history that they were relaying. You can also think about research questions around perceptions, experiences, sensitive topics, how meaning might be experienced or constructed. There are examples here: the grieving process in Czech women following perinatal loss, associations between seeking sex through the internet and HIV transmission risk, the construction of academic identities. So that hopefully gives you a broad idea there of some of the research that's been done. The key thing, you've got access to geographically dispersed groups. So they can be from global, can't they, in terms of it being email. Also, groups that might not want to participate in traditional face-to-face research for various, or unable to, for various reasons, be it practical, shyness, or things that are illegal or socially sanctioned activities. Some other examples there are people experiencing certain circumstances or similar interests, so the information-seeking process of social scientists or the experiences of young people with cerebral palsy. The references are all at the end of the slides if anyone wants to follow any of these up. In terms of the practicalities of conducting email interviews, you need to think about methodological issues. So will the method produce a kind of data that's appropriate for your research question? Have you got enough time to collect data that way? You also need to think about who you're doing research with. So do the people feel comfortable writing accounts? Have they got the time to devote to lengthy descriptions? Are you favouring more articulate people? Will people not want to participate because you're asking them to sit at a computer and write? Is it more suited to young participants? Now, there's evidence suggests that the internet and email is used by a wide variety of age ranges, but statistically it is younger people that do use the internet more. So you've also got to think about access in a practical sense, but also feeling confident using computers. So it's really important to consider who the group is that you're doing the research with, who the people are, their background, and whether it's an appropriate tool. Now, I'll quite quickly go through some of the ethical issues because I'm conscious of time. So, as always, you should always work within ethical frameworks. Think about funding body policies, institutional ones, in terms of confidentiality and online research. The BPS are good on ethical guidance for internet-mediated research. You can think about private nature of email, so you're not extracting data from public forums, which raises ethical issues, which we had some questions about earlier. Emails are relatively private. You've got to protect participants. So there is an anonymity, but there's hacking IP addresses. You can't consider it a truly anonymous method. So you've got to think about that protection issue. There's a link there to the Association of Internet Researchers, which is a great resource. In terms of disadvantages, there is a real dependence on access and reliable technology, competence on behalf of the participant, a willingness. Technology can fail, it can crash, and the key issue is to back up data. You also need to think about now, when I was doing the research, smartphones weren't a thing, so it was all done on laptops and iPads. It was that long ago I did my PhD. I'm still publishing from it though, which is good. It shows how these things go on and on. Smartphones, tablets, PCs, it's multimodal, isn't it? You've got to have flexible time frames, and another issue is the fact that participants can lose interest, so they can just stop emailing you back. So you need to think about building rapport, the fact that you don't meet them face to face. How do you do that over email? Set expectations, so can you email me back within a week or two, that type of thing. Some interesting things in terms of the data, you get a loss of voice inflections, so you lose that non-linguistic features, so that can lead to a decline in the quality of the data, so you don't get the intonation, the rises, the body language that you get with a face-to-face interview. You can also misinterpret during analysis because it's written as opposed to spoken. So some of the participants would use text speak or some drug terms that I wasn't familiar with, so I had to go and check those back with them. Some would use emoticons and emojis, so I knew if they were being sarcastic. There was a disembodied nature of email interviews, which is interesting to think about. So you don't know who the person is, obviously, that is completing the email interview, and you also need to check the interpretation to overcome any ambiguity. So, a few minutes on analysis and conclusion. So So I used thematic analysis with my data. Did it by hand, didn't do computers. I'm a bit more old school than that. Very messy process, but enjoyable. I used categories from the interview topic guide that I had, and then I identified pattern meanings across the experiences. You could use a variety of methods for email interviewing. So you could do narrative analysis, highlight some of the complex stories. Discourse analysis would help you show how people construct experiences. And obviously you could use software as well, and Vivo, Atlas, Hyper Research, just to name a few. So to conclude, very much for my data, email interviewing was very convenient, it was inexpensive, and it created really rich and valuable data. When I compared the face-to-face and the email, the transcripts were often lengthier via email. The length of answers to the questions were lengthier. Because I wasn't sat there looking at the person as they responded, there wasn't that pressure. They could just write as much as they wanted without having that sense of the researcher being there in the room. The geographically dispersed nature of participants was great as well. So people that might not want to participate face-to-face. But there are limitations that you've got to be aware of that I've covered briefly today, and obvious ethical issues. I combined, obviously, email interviews with more traditional face-to-face, and you can consider that. Don't just replace face-to-face with email because you think, oh, it's cheaper, it's easier. But think about combining the two, offering participants a choice to obtain a diverse sample. There's a lot of references and further reading I've put in there. So obviously you can get the PDF. I don't mind that going out at all to people if you want to follow up any of that. Thank you for listening.